Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be discussing about what are subqueries, what are the different types of subqueries, and how we can use them in SQL Server. So let's get started. So there are different forms of subqueries. The first one is a self-contained subqueries, and then we have the correlated subqueries. So let's talk about the self-contained subqueries first. So in the subqueries, there's an outer query and an inner query. In self-contained subqueries, there's no dependency on the outer query. It can return different forms of results. It can be a single value. It can be a table with multiple values in a single column, or it can be a multi-column table result. Let's take a look at the example in the SQL Server. So I have the SQL Server running right here, and I've got the production.product table in the AdventureWorks 2012 database. What I'm gonna do first is I'm just gonna go ahead and do a select star query from the production.product table. And if I execute this one, I've got a bunch of different attributes, which is basically describing the product, which is the product ID. Then we have the product name, and we have the product number, and we have different attributes. So we're basically interested in the list price. So let's rewrite this query in the form of subquery. Now just actually copied and pasted here the query. Now in the subquery, there has to be two queries as we have discussed. There has to be an outer query, and there has to be an inner query as well. So we have written the outer query, and now we have to write another query. So let's give it an alias, and we're gonna say where p dot, and we were interested in the list price, so we're gonna say p dot list price is equals to, and then we're gonna have another query which is gonna act as an inner query, and that will be the self-contained subquery. And then we're gonna say select maximum of the list price from production.product table. So this is basically the inner query, and then we have the outer query. So I'm just gonna go ahead and run this query, and now I have the products basically, which has the maximum list price from the production.product table. So we have a couple of products over there. So what we're doing is basically we have an outer query and we have an inner query, but both are independent queries. So the inner query is independent of the outer query because the values are not dependent, because they are not referencing the values. So we have the outer query, which is basically having select star from production.product table. So it's displaying all the values, all the attributes from the production.product table, whereas the inner query is basically retrieving the maximum list price and passing it on as a clause in the condition and in the first table. So that's basically a self-contained subquery in which both the queries and the reason the self-contained subqueries is one where both the queries are independent of each other. Or in simple words, it can actually run by itself. So if I actually highlight this query and run this independently, that will be run. That can be run as well without having an intervention of the outer query. So let's move on to the other subquery. So the other form of the subqueries is the correlated subqueries. And correlated subqueries are basically the subqueries, other than the fact that the column in the outer query table is referenced by the inner query in the correlated subqueries. So in the correlated subqueries, there is a dependency on both the queries. So the inner query is basically dependent on the outer query. So let's take a look at the example of the correlated subquery in the SQL Server. Now let's review the self-contained subquery which we have written before. So I'm just gonna go ahead and query this self-contained subquery and hit the execute button. So now we can see that there are 4 products which are basically displaying with the maximum list price over here. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rewrite the same query, and I'm just gonna modify it a little bit to make it a correlated query. Now I have written a correlated subquery, and what I've used is basically the same production.product table, and I've got the inner query here, which is what it's basically doing is it is selecting the maximum list price, but we have a further condition, and what it's actually doing is this condition right here. We got 2 aliases, the one from the outer query which is P1, and then we have P2 which is from the inner query, and then what we are doing is we have a further condition in the inner query which is for the attribute make flag. So if we go ahead and review our initial table, we have a make flag attribute which is 0 or 1. So what we're doing is we're actually having a clause on the make flag, and we're having a condition that the make flag of the outer query should be equivalent to the make flag of the inner query. So let's go ahead and run this query. I'm gonna hit the execute button. Now we can see that there is 6 tuples as a result set. Whereas in the self-contained query, in the self-contained subquery, where there was not the subclause, where there was not the condition of the make flag, it was displaying us 5 rows in the result set. Now it's actually displaying us 6 rows in the result set, and that is because we have another row with a make flag 0, and what's actually it's doing is it is selecting the maximum list price which has a make flag of 0 and displaying it here in the result set, and in this case which is 159 for the make flag 0. So this is actually a correlated subquery which has a dependency on the outer query. So if we go ahead and try to run the inner query, we will get an error because it is actually dependent on the outer query. So this correlated subquery is the one which has 2 queries, inner query and outer query, and the inner query is basically referencing something to the outer query, and it's actually independent. It's not independent, so it is dependent on the outer query. So hope that actually explains the concept of the correlated and the self-contained subqueries. One more important thing to note is that we can also use the subqueries in place of the attributes. In this example, we have used it in place of the conditions, in place of the where conditions, but we can also use it in place of the attributes, or we can also use it in place of the table names. So we can have instead of specifying the table name here, we can write a whole subquery, and that can actually add as a table. And we can also have a subquery here which can actually get the attribute names, and we can display it in a subquery. Hope that actually explains the concept of the subqueries and the self-contained and the correlated subqueries. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you like it, and you have a great day.